Wizard of Oz is one of the most iconic films in the history of cinema. Very few artistic works from the 1930s have managed to persist within the public consciousness. Even now, 84 years later, most of you know or have at least heard of the characters from this film. Far less known, however, are the people portraying them. Principal photography for The Wizard of Oz lasted from October 1938 to March 1939. During these 5 months, the stars of the movie were subjected to some of the most horrendous conditions in the history of the American film industry. When it was all said and done, not a single character managed to leave the land of Oz unscathed. That's not to say that things were much better back home in Kansas. The 1930s were the period of major turmoil and hardship for the American public. The Great Depression ravaged almost every sector of the economy. While most of the American industries were struggling, the film industry was booming. To escape the dread of everyday life, most of the population sought refuge in cinema. Nowadays, about 1 to 10 Americans have gone to movies in the past week. In the 30s, however, it was not uncommon for half the population to pay a weekly visit to the theater. Hollywood was in the midst of its golden age. During this time, no studio was more illustrious than MGM. They were the studio to provide audiences with the biggest stars and the grandest spectacle. MGM essentially smoked the rest of Hollywood with its unmatched financial and critical success. In the 1937, we saw one of the most groundbreaking films ever made. That year, Walt Disney will release his first animated feature film, Snow White and the Seven Dwarfs. Snow White's record-breaking success inspired MGM to produce a spectacular fantasy of their own. In 1938, MGM bought out the rights to L. Frank Baum's popular children's novel, The Wonderful Wizard of Oz, and the rest was history. Unlike Snow White, The Wizard of Oz was entirely live action, which presented a series of challenges while attempting a transformation of fantasy into reality. One of the most iconic scenes in the movie is when everything transitions from sepia to color. The official coloring method used to develop the film was Technicolor, which required heavy exposure due to the process of splitting image into different colored channels. As a result, the set required an exorbitant amount of lighting, so much so that the temperature on stage often surpassed 38 degrees Celsius. The heat was suffocating and stagehands frequently had to be carried off after fainting. Set lighting was so intense that some actors even claimed to suffer permanent vision damage. Exhaustion suffered from the excessive heat was only magnified by the arduous production schedule. For 6 days a week, the actors walked into the studio at 4 a.m. and didn't leave the studio until 7 p.m. A significant part of each actor was dedicated to their meticulous preparation and removal of the costumes. Scarecrow, Cowardly Lion, and Tin Man are one of the most recognizable trios in fiction. All of these characters were brought to life by the skilled design and makeup artist Jack Dawn. While the costumes presented an impeccable exterior, the conditions weren't so pleasant on the inside. Every morning as the Scarecrow, Ray Bolger would have to spend an hour getting his latex and plastic mask painstakingly glued to his face. He would then spend an hour getting it removed every evening. The mask completely covered his facial pores, meaning he was physically unable to sweat. One could only imagine what it must have felt to wear that thing for 15 hours a day. But Ray Bolger didn't have to imagine. For 22 weeks, it was his reality. By the end of filming, the repeated applications of the mask left Ray with permanent grooves around his mouth and chin. The Tin Man was played by Buddy Ebsen for about 9 days. That's how long he lasted during filming, until he was hospitalized from a severe reaction to the Tin Man's metallic makeup. Ebsen's silver face paint was made from aluminum powder, the very same thing that would end up coating the inside of his lungs, nearly asphyxiating him. As he sat bedridden under an oxygen tank in the hospital, the studio could have given him less sympathy. Producer Mervyn LeRoy repeatedly phoned the hospital demanding that Ebsen return to the set. After 2 weeks out of action, the studio replaced him with Jack Haley. Buddy Ebsen would end up becoming one of the unluckiest men in the show business. Not only was he unceremoniously fired from what would have been the biggest role in his entire career, the incident left him with chronic bronchitis. Bert Lahr's lion costume was called Pear to carrying around a mattress, an extremely heavy mattress. The bulk of the costume consisted of a 60-pound lion hide, a real lion hide, combined with additional padding, puts the weight of the costume around 45 kilos. Bert Lahr would frequently have to take off his costume in between shots to avoid exhaustion. The prosthetic mask covering his face didn't allow him to fully open his mouth, forcing him to consume all his on-set foods through a straw. This wasn't the last of it, however. The worst costume incident happened with Margaret Hamilton, better known as the Wicked Witch. In 1938, the only tried and true method to make someone look green was with copper paint. Copper, of course, is toxic when ingested by humans. This was known back then, but the studio showed no restraint in applying the green concoction directly to Hamilton's face and hands. Wearing the makeup on set was a constant struggle. Once it was on, Hamilton was unable to touch anything without staining it, and required assistance to perform even the simplest of tasks. But the day-to-day struggles with the makeup were pale in comparison to the accident she suffered on December 23, 1938. On that day, Hamilton was scripted to exit a scene in a furious cloud of smoke, but the pyrotechnics were ignited too early, causing Hamilton to be engulfed in flames. The accident resulted in second-degree burns on the whole right side of her face. The skin on her right hand was entirely scalded off. But before she could even receive medical attention, she had to slowly and excruciatingly have the copper makeup removed from her freshly burned skin. With rubbing alcohol, of course, Margaret Hamilton would end up spending the next 6 weeks in the hospital before returning to the set. The long-term health effects on Margaret Hamilton are far less known. What is known is that she would go on to develop Alzheimer's later on in life, a condition that has been linked to copper poisoning. Judy Garland, who played Dorothy, was ruthlessly bullied by all her other co-stars and actors. Big egos couldn't accept a little girl being the main star, so they treat her horribly. The only person on set who was nice to her, the only friend she made, was ironically the one who played Witch, Margaret Hamilton. Bullying was not the only thing Judy had to deal with, however. As fate would have it, the studio kept her on a steady intake of amphetamines to keep her working long into the day. Years later, she claimed she would only sleep 4 hours every 3 days. By the end of production, Garland was addicted to drugs, an addiction that would last for the rest of her life. On June 22, 1969, Judy Garland was found dead from an overdose on her bathroom floor. She was just 47 years old. Hollywood has the ability to make our wildest dreams and imaginations come to life. However, the magic of creating and crafting immersive fantasies comes with a very real dark side. Oftentimes, it's easy for studios to lose sight of the real-life human beings at their disposal, and to end up treating them as marionettes. It would be easy to chalk up all the trauma from The Wizard of Oz as simply being a product of its time. Back then, studios would get away with just about anything. If any actor fought back, they would be blacklisted from the industry. However, even after the studio's iron grip over the industry was broken, actors gained more leverage over their careers. It would be naive to suggest that much has changed in Hollywood. In the business of telling the biggest stories possible, the smaller stories often get left behind. Thank you for listening.